Very nice to see you. Yeah, okay, I think we should start.
Oh, absolutely here now.
Okay, Teresa, should we get going?
My lords, your excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Frontline Club. My name is Teresa Porybna. I'm the director of the Czech Center, London, and we are very proud that this special event is part of our Made in Prague festival season. Before we start the debate, I would like to thank the Frontline Club for hosting us, as well as the Czech British Chamber of Commerce for supporting this event. And before I forget to invite you, after the discussion, you're all invited to join us downstairs for a small reception. Made in Prague Festival is a season of films, discussion, arts, and theatre. It's running throughout November in various venues across London. You can find more about our program in these brochures, which are somewhere here spread around. What holds these events together this year is an anniversary, the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic. And we are very happy that we are reflecting this revolution not just through discussions, not just through books, but also through the arts. And I welcome you to explore it with us a little bit more. I will now pass on the microphone to our guest, the senior editor of The Economist, Edward Lucas, and His Excellency, the Ambassador Michal Žantovský. I'm sure you will enjoy the discussion, and I'm sure the book will raise many questions. My personal question is, where does the ambassador find time to do it? So thank you again for coming. Enjoy the evening.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for turning out on this cold, rainy night. I am really honoured to be here, and the main message I have is please buy this book. One copy for yourself, one copy to give as your relatives for Christmas, another copy to give to your friends for Christmas. It really is terrific. I've known Michael, Your Excellency, for 25 years, a bit more than 25 years. I met him in, I think, January 1989, when I turned up in Prague as a very inexperienced and enthusiastic, and rather overconfident freelance journalist. I was the only Western freelance journalist in Prague, and my first Czech phrase was that I was a na svobodné nože, on a free foot. And Michael was incredibly nice to me, and he didn't need to be. I mean, I now realise he was actually working for Havel. I thought he was just the competition. He was the Reuters stringer there. And I didn't speak. I spoke Polish with a heavy Czech accent, which I fondly believed was Czech, which was, it gradually became Czech, and I now can speak Polish with a Czech accent. But you were incredibly nice to me and very forgiving of the many errors and blunders that I made, and I've always been very grateful to you for that. But it's not just in a spirit of friendship that I commend the book to you, but also in admiration. I can't say that every bit of the chronology of this book was lived firsthand by me, because a lot of it predates 1989 and some of it predates the year of my birth. But I can say that of the events it describes them even better than I remember them, and my memory is pretty good. There's a fantastic mixture of anecdote and analysis, extremely sensitive touches on some of the most delicate and controversial things, but beautifully accurate and revealing, and I can't recommend it strongly enough. I did find one mistake in it, but I'll tell you later. But it's to do with the Russian, not the Czech. There's only one H in Czechist. But what we're going to do is, I'm going to ask Michael questions, because you haven't come to hear my reminiscences of the past. You haven't come to hear Michael. And we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take some questions from the floor. We will be finished punctually by 8:30 for those of you who have things to go on to. But I want to start off really with, I think, the event that must be most uppermost in our minds, which is the funeral of Václav Havel, because that, in a way, drew all the threads together, that he was mourned in not just by Czechs, but also by Slovaks. It brought together a huge array of foreigners who'd known and liked and admired, and in some case, loved him, and there was a kind of theatrical element to it, which I think he would have very much appreciated, possibly some other elements that he might have raised one of those famous Havel eyebrows. So perhaps we can start off with your recollections of the funeral and what you feel it signified.
Yes, it brought back many a memory, and it brought back the importance of the man. And it was not quite self-evident at the time, because the last few years of Havel's life were years of personal decline and also of some public amnesia of sorts, and one could be forgiven for having the impression that he was no longer relevant to the events of the day. It was 2011. We were in the midst of the financial crisis and whatnot, and then he died, and it came as a shock to so many people, and the public response was so emotional, so spontaneous, and so massive that that all of a sudden people realized what he meant for history, what he meant for the Czech nation and for the Slovak nation as well, and some of us, including myself, realized what he meant to me personally, and it was a shock that I found difficult to get out of. I was Christmas time 2011, and I was in a haze for like a couple of weeks, and just couldn't cope with it, and then I thought, you know, maybe at least I owed him a book, and that's how this started.
I think we should start off really going back now to the beginning, because I think that we, particularly as Westerners and looking at the world through the prism of what we witnessed in, I guess, most cases here, witnessed in 1989. Just looking around, yeah, I guess we all remember 1989 pretty much. But there's a feeling of kind of inevitability about it, that you saw communism collapse, Berlin Wall comes down, the distance come to power, these countries join the EU and NATO, and that was pretty much the way the tide came up the beach, and we assumed that that was what was going to happen. But of course, for Havel's early years, the tide, it was absolutely the opposite. The world was turning upside down in a way that we find very hard to imagine. And his roots in this very privileged and successful pre-war family, which became kind of unpeople, former people, after 1948, must have left very deep scars on him, this feeling that you can't really rely on tomorrow being the same as today, and the unpredictability of everything.
Yes, well, he was an outcast from early on. That was clear. It was made clear to him in school. It was made clear to him in the army when he was inducted to the communist army. He tried to feign some kind of a disease that would make him ineligible, and one of the officers said at that time, you know, Havel will serve even with one leg, and that's how they treated him. So he you know, experienced this early on, but he also learned to cope with it early on, and he took it as a part of his life, of his destiny, and he was, on the contrary, quite shocked and surprised, as he expressed on a number of occasions, when he was all of a sudden elevated to the highest office in the land, he didn't feel quite comfortable in that role, and remarked on that quite often, and it was a bit of a struggle when, you know, if you were one of the people serving with him, because on the one hand it was very natural, very spontaneous, and very charming. But on the other hand, if you were his spokesman, you had to tell him, I mean, you have to look presidential and act presidential, because that's what you are now, and didn't come easily to him at all.
But of course it left him, I mean, one of the other things that was so interesting was that he'd retained the really excellent manners of pre-war Czechoslovakia. There was behind the slightly rumpled bohemian exterior, and sometimes bohemians are rather, can be quite rude and difficult to deal with its incredible politeness, and I think you described it very well as a hypertrophied sense of responsibility. He was sort of over-responsible. He worried perhaps rather more than he should have done about letting other people down, and this impacted quite heavily into his ability to function as a really sort of ruthless, effective politician, didn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, he was polite and courteous to a fault, on occasions even to people who didn't deserve.
Would you like to mention some of them?
Well, you know,
Barbara Waters gets particularly sharp, Sally, in your book.
I think I will leave it, most of it, for my memoirs, if I ever write any. But yes, Barbara Walters came. She's a famous American TV journalist. She came early on in February 1990 to interview him for the 2020 program on ABC, I believe. Yeah. And there was no chemistry between the two of them, and she kept complaining that he didn't look her in the eye. And so we explained to her that he, you know, if you spend 5 years in prison, you would not necessarily look people in the eye, because they were interrogators and could read something of that. And then she complained that he didn't show any emotion, and I got upset. So I said, you know, perhaps you don't provoke any emotion in him, you know, and it went south from then on.
It got worse after that.
Yes. Not not my.
But I think we should before we get really on to Havel as a politician, we should give due weight to his work as a playwright and as an essayist, because that was really his kind of moral and cultural, intellectual, spiritual foundation. So try to bring us back, because I guess perhaps some people here would remember the 60s. I think very few people here would know about the 60s in Prague. But give us a sense of this atmosphere of once Havel is now no longer a stagehand, he's managed to get into kind of semi-official cultural life where he can write freely. And talk us through those years up to 1968, which was really, to my mind, was almost the high point of his literary or development as a playwright.
Yes, the 60s were a wondrous time in many countries. It was a special time in Czechoslovakia. It was a time of the renaissance of Czechoslovak culture and of relative freedom of expression for the artists and the intellectuals. So, you know, the new wave of the Czech cinema, for example, directors like Forman and Menzel, the, you know, writers like Hrabal and Skvoretzky, the time when, I'm sorry to say, rock and roll burst on the scene in Czechoslovakia and changed the lifestyle of the young generation completely. And last but not least, the theater, which the mushrooming of what we called the small theater scene of, you know, you would say off-Broadway theaters, and Havel was a crucial element in one of those, and he wrote his first plays for the theater on the balustrade, and the first of them, the garden party, was a revelation for.
And I think you were at the premiere, where you were the first time.
No, I was not at the premiere. I was 14 years old. I mean, they would not invite me to the premiere, but just the same, I saw the play 7 or 8 times.
Yes,
I know people who saw it 15 or 16 times, and you know, people just couldn't get enough of it, and they.
And why was it? Explain to people here who don't know the background, or maybe horror of horrors, perhaps have not even read or seen the garden party. Explain why it was so explosive in that context.
Because it was a metaphor of the existential situation. It is an existentialist play, basically, of people living in a system, in a bureaucratic, heartless system that is only concerned with its own self-preservation and with the internal struggles and games that it plays. And so it was an excellent metaphor for the communist system, but it was not just that. It was it could serve, and that explains its popularity abroad in dozens of countries, including this country. It can serve as a metaphor for any bureaucratic system, and it's basically a story based on the layout of one of the simplest Czech fairy tales about this simple young boy venturing out of his village and making it big in the world because he's clever and he learns how to play the bureaucratic institutions against one another without really being involved or participating in or understanding anything that goes on, and in the end he ends up one being on top, being the head of the big institution that is finally formed as a merger of the two institutions that struggled with each other throughout the play. And second, he loses his identity. He doesn't know who he is anymore.
Yes.
And this theme of identity is absolutely central to Havel.
I hate seeing people standing uncomfortably at the back when there are, I was going to say comfortable chairs, there are chairs at the front. So do come and don't feel shy, just come and sit down here. But let's fast forward quickly through, I guess everybody here knows the story of the Soviet invasion in 1968, or the Soviet-led invasion of 1968. As you so beautifully put, the Warsaw Pact was the only military alliance in history which attacked its own members. But I think people don't quite understand necessarily the significance of the way Havel became, sort of really nurtured the dissident movement into life. There wasn't, after the normalization, there wasn't really a dissident movement in the early 70s. It was very fragmented, a few very brave individuals, but he really played an extraordinary role in bravely and sometimes quite discreetly, but pushing, nurturing the sentiment of independent thought, and then bring us up to the launch of Charter 77.
Well, maybe a few corrections, Ed, and I acknowledge there's only one H in Czechist. It's first of all, I'm not sure that the Warsaw Pact was the only military pact in history that attacked its own members, but it was the only military pact in history that attacked exclusively its own members. You know, it's an important distinction. The second thing, yes, the early part of the 70s was not avoid. I mean, there were some signs of opposition. Isolated, there was a group of left-wing students and intellectuals who even contemplated some kind of a direct action, and some of them ended up in prison. There were a few petitions on behalf of political prisoners, which Havel also signed. There was another petition organized by a Czech chess master that Havel didn't want to sign, but he felt he would chicken out if he didn't sign it, so he signed it anyway. And but on the whole, it was a time of normalization, people withdrawing into their own shells, etc., etc. And Havel, for a time, actually went along with the wave. He moved out of Prague with Olga. He stayed at Hradeček in his country house, and he was not. He was watched, but he was not overly bothered, as long as he stayed where he was and scribbled some of these plays that the secret police did not probably understand.
And he had
anyway.
a Mercedes, and he was getting money from abroad.
He was getting money from abroad, but you know, they, as long as you were not publicly active, they, the system did not necessarily hold it against you. You know, they would let you live a nice life if you didn't bother them, and for a time he lived that way, and in some of his letters, in some of his correspondence, he was aware.
Yes.
He was.
And then we get this big, really quite sharp change with the Committee for the Protection of the Unjustly Persecuted, with classic people charter, and it's almost like he's changing gear in his life and getting into much more substantial and risky confrontation with the authorities.
And my reading of that is that he wrote 2 plays during the time, and he was very unhappy with the plays, and he realized he was not really getting across to, on the one hand, to an audience, and on the other hand, to his inner understanding of himself, and he sought of ways of breaking out of the isolation. And the first thing he tried in 1974 was work as a manual laborer
in a brewery.
In a brewery,
yeah.
and he did, and he encountered a very upset situation in which the brewer or brewmaster in the brewery, who was asked to report on him by the secret police, asked Havel to write the reports, because he was an intellectual after all and a writer, and the brewmaster didn't know what to write. You know, it was not his. So, and Havel wrote a beautiful, one of his most successful one-act play based on the experience, called Audience, and I think it served for him also as a way of going out in the real world, breaking out, and realizing that if the situation is to change, he couldn't wait for the other side to make the first move. He would have to make the first move, and he wrote the letter to President Husak. He started writing it in the autumn of 1974. He finished in 1975, and still not much happened, because he sent the letter to Husak. He never got an answer, except a note from the office of Husak to the effect that they don't answer letters that were published abroad and are meant to defame the country and the leader, and then came the story with involving rock musicians. There was
because this is very important, because Havel himself didn't
it was
really
crucial.
but he didn't really like rock music himself, did he? It wasn't his.
He liked rock music, all right, but he didn't like what there are. You know, I don't know how many aficionados of rock music are present in this room, but there are subdivisions and distinctions, and Havel liked what we would call the soft rock.
Yeah.
At that time, so he listened to bands like the Bee Gees and to Johnny Cash and etc. etc. But there was the hardcore element in the musical circles, and they played what they called underground rock, or and they fashioned themselves after groups like Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention and the Velvet Underground and people like that. And they became, not because they were overly political, but because they didn't adjust. They were unconformist, so they became to be first watched, then harassed, and then persecuted by the police, and it came to trial in which a few of them, of a group called the Plastic People of the Universe, which still exists.
They played in London not so long ago.
They played in London not so long ago, and I will see them playing in Prague next week. And so they were sent to jail for a couple of years, and Havel realized and reflected on that if this can happen to, you know, people who didn't want to protest necessarily, who didn't want to do anything but do their own thing, so to speak, it can happen to everybody. That if the freedom is denied to them, then there is no hope for anyone else. And the experience of the trial in the autumn of 1976 led directly to the launch of Charter 77 at the beginning of 1977, and the rest, as they say, is history.
I'm aware we've spent the first half hour, we've only got to Charter, but that's kind of deliberate, because I think for a lot of people who know the outlines of Václav Havel's story, it's almost as if history starts with Charter, moves rapidly on to 1989, at which point he then goes to America, meets the Dalai Lama, and the Czech Republic gets into NATO and the EU, and we all live happily ever after. So I've deliberately spent a bit more time on that, and I hope in the questions we can fill in maybe some of the other gaps. But I think I'd like to spend a bit on the effect of prison on him, because you point out in the book that his health, which was never that great even beforehand, really was permanently damaged by his time in prison. But it's also from his prison writings, from his letters to Olga, that we have these absolutely classic things of the power of the powerless, and really the core of his political philosophy. But one of the things that you deal with this very beautifully in the book, and it is quite sensitive, is his rather unusual marriage to Olga. And he's actually writing to her in the book at one point, I think, saying, "I'm so glad you've met my mistress and get on well with her, and please can you, between you, organise the following things." So can you just sketch us a bit how, perhaps something we don't get so much of in the public persona, Havel the husband?
It was a very unconventional marriage, and it was by most standard definitions, it was a flawed marriage. But in my own experience, it was one of the strongest marriages that I've ever seen. But it's very difficult to explain, because it's true Havel was never never, or as far as I know, faithful to his wife. And on occasion she may not have been faithful to him, and he sometimes treated her with an air of superiority, even condescension, but at the same time he depended on her for his life. I mean, she was the first he approached to ask her opinion about everything, and he deeply valued and respected her opinion, and she cherished him and respected him, and at the same time could be extremely critical of him, you know, even harshly critical. So, you know, every element of that marriage I know of was flawed, but together they added up to an incredible relationship, and it included his, I'm afraid, infidelities, which he had a habit of telling about to his wife, and sometimes even apparently sought her advice on how to deal with the complexities of the relationships, and some of it you can also find in some of his later plays. So I, again, because he professed to live in truth, and I'm sure he would not want it any other way. So I do, not in much detail, but I do comment or mention that in the book. But I hope I was able to do justice to how strong that relationship really was.
We're going to come on to some questions and points from the floor in a moment, but I think I'd like to just fast forward again, going through the sort of dramatic events of 1989, which we both lived through and were probably for both of us the most extraordinary days and weeks of our lives, to that extraordinary moment when Havel turns up on, I think, New Year's Eve 1989. With knowing that the next 3 days are public holidays, in Prague Castle, which you so beautifully describe as a kind of Kafkaesque maze of tunnels and locked rooms, run by people whose life's work had been keeping people like Havel out of places like Prague Castle, and the extraordinary team of, you don't put it like this, but one might say oddballs and deadbeats that he assembled to try and guide him through this political and indeed physical maze. And my feeling in retrospect is he did amazingly well, but at the time it was just an atmosphere of non-stop chaos and improvisation.
Oh yes, it was, and couldn't have been otherwise, because first of all, as Havel wisely wrote in one of his books, I think, no one is ever prepared for history. It's a fallacy to think that you can plan and prepare for history. And you already mentioned, Ed, how clear it was that the system would fall down and it would change, and we would join NATO and the EU. That's in retrospect. I mean, going forward, nothing like that was ever clear to anyone. And Havel himself, in September 1989, when I interviewed him, he still thought that, you know, he would probably die in that regime, and that the world as we knew it would continue to exist. And in 3 years, there would be no Soviet Union, no Czechoslovakia, no Yugoslavia, and the world would change completely. If you look at the declassified documents from that era, the CIA, the intelligence agencies had no inkling it was going to happen. The US ambassador in Prague sent a cable on the 10th of November 1989 to Washington saying, you know, the Czechs are so content with their lot and they are so risk averse that, you know, nothing's ever going to happen here. I mean, she was Shirley Temple Black, the famous child actress, the ambassador.
Well, I have to say, I wrote a piece for The Independent on the 11th of November describing a trial of dissidents in Bratislava, where I said the likelihood of these people confronting their persecutors across a negotiating table rather than across a courtroom is depressingly small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's how unprepared we were.
Yeah.
And even more so for the fact that the president's office, I mean, there was a president before Havel, Mr. Husak, whom we already mentioned. So there was a president, but there was no office. The office was in the headquarters of the Communist Party, not in the president's office. So there were a few manual typewriters and an aging lady or two who occasionally wrote a letter.
And a high-tech communications centre in the basement where they listened to all the phone calls.
There was a room where they listened to the phone calls. There was another room with a direct line to the Kremlin.
And please tell us the story, which I think encapsulates Václav Havel's sense of fun about what he did when he found out that.
Well, he wanted to speak to Gorbachev, of course, and there was. So we went there and tried to crank the phone or whatever. I don't have an exact recall of what it looked like, but anyway, we were connected to, or he was connected to, a lady speaking Russian somewhere in Moscow, and he asked to speak to Mr. Gorbachev, and she told him to hold. So we held, at which the phone went dead forever. I mean, there was never any. So that was the end of our direct line to Kremlin, and there were a few surprises like that. There were underground corridors and shelters for the communist nomenclature.
They're probably still state secrets, so you should be careful about.
Well, you know, yeah, you can unwittingly tell state secrets. I don't know, but I kind of doubt it. Well, anyway, so we came across a number of surprises, and we had to get some stuff. I mean, there were originally 8 or 10 people coming with Havel to the castle, and so we had to find other people, and there were young girls in the castle, in the courtyard of the castle, who worked as guides, taking tourists around. So we quickly realized we were in luck, because at least they spoke some foreign language. So we asked them, you know, would you like to come in the president's office work as a secretary? And some of them did and stayed with us throughout. And so yeah, it was improvisation, but yeah. I don't know of any other way to approach such change.
Yes. Well, we're going to come to questions, but let me just ask you one final question from here, which is, what do you think are the biggest misperceptions of Havel, both at home and abroad? What is it, if you could get one thing across the Czechs that they don't get, and one thing across to the outside world that they don't get, what would that be?
Well, there's even things I didn't get. You know, there's a stereotype of Havel as an impractical idealist, somewhat naive, who had great ideas, and sometimes found it difficult to implement them or to make them come to pass. And in part it is true, but he was not just a dreamer. And only when I came across the letters he wrote, the correspondence he wrote in 1980s to Czech exiles abroad, who helped him to smuggle money and computers and Xeroxes, tape recorders, and saw the detailed way in which he discussed the arcane minutiae of things like EPROM, that's a kind of a chip in a computer.
To make Western computers print
right
out
in
with
Czech, yes.
Czech font.
Yeah. And he spends pages, describing the problem and trying to resolve it and trying to get $200 for this cause and $200 for this publication. Do you realize how much of practical, boring, unidealistic work he put into the project as a dissident? And he approached his presidency in much the same way, and sometimes he concentrated. He was not trained to be a manager, so sometimes he concentrated too much on the details. But he certainly did not live in the clouds, just dreaming. That's a misapprehension that I think we can dispel. Yeah.
Well, I could carry on for another 10 hours, and I probably will, but not right now. But let's take some points and questions from the floor. But if you have a very long-winded anecdote featuring yourself and Václav Havel, I implore you not to tell it here, but wait until the reception afterwards, when undoubtedly you'll have an envious audience longing to tell their own anecdotes in return. So please can we have short questions and short, punchy points. The gentleman here, first of all, yes. And then the lady down there.
Misha Klemesh, thank you very much. It's about Klaus versus Havel and their difference on markets. I asked Anne Applebaum once at LSE about Klaus and his economic reforms, and Klaus said that the third way wasn't possible because the third way was 68, and it was crushed by, as we know, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact forces. And then he tied that interpretation of 68 with the three market reforms, saying that we had to privatize everything because there was no, other way, middle way. And
yes.
And do you agree with that point of view or not?
So the battle of the two Václavs, which is, I thought that would come up pretty soon. I wasn't sure it was going to come straight away. There's a lady down there. We'll take three questions together, and then, yes. Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Hello, my name is Marion Maltino. In the period just before Havel became president, were there not other contenders? When we read the story, it seems so much like there he was, and you read the story of how he got there. But there must have been lots of other dissidents, and there must have been lots of other people who were positioned. You very seldom get a political process where it's kind of unanimous who's going to lead. And I'd really be curious to know a bit about that.
Right.
Good. Okay, and we'll take one more point. There's a gentleman over there with his black specs. Thanks.
Hi. In the discussion of the two Václavs, I'm ex-Reuters from Prague in the 1990s. So many times every day almost, we argued over the perspectives of either Václav in the stories we were doing. I'm wondering how far you carry that back. Was it the first meeting in '89 when apparently Václav Havel referred to Václav Klaus as Dr. Wolf? or does it go beyond that? How deeply did that dichotomy between these two Václavs really take hold?
Okay, that's great. And in a moment, I just see the man who sent me to Prague, I think, is in the audience. We'll come to you in a moment, Steve. Those questions.
Well, I think they are very relevant and wonderful questions. First, on the two Václavs. Again, it is a stereotype that Václav Havel and Václav Klaus were antagonists who were at loggerheads throughout their political lives and couldn't get along. I think it shows that for all their differences, and they had significant differences, and I may comment on a couple of those. They were real politicians, and as politicians, they both realized at certain points they couldn't get some things done without each other, and so there was a lot of bickering. There was a lot of especially on Klaus' side, I think there was a lot of aggrieved responses and faces and insignificant episodes like that. But if you look at the important things like privatization, the campaign to join NATO, even the campaign to join the European Union, although Klaus today is declaring himself as the sworn enemy of the European Union, but I'm sorry to say he was the one who put the application in for the Czech Republic to join the European Union. So they were able to forget about their differences and do the important things together. Also, they both realized that there were things that the other can do that they can't do themselves. Václav Havel, I'm afraid to say, did not have a deep grasp of economics and of how the free market operates, etc., etc. Klaus is a very erudite economist, although he does not always go by his own. Well, I hold against him, but he doesn't often go by his own prescriptions. So, and at the same time, at that time at least, Klaus realized that what Havel gave to the country in terms of image abroad and the ability to make the outside world focus on what we were working at and what we needed was irreplaceable.
And he gave a very, I thought it was very touching that he gave such a good tribute to Václav Havel when he died, despite having, you beautifully skewer him with his, I think you call an act of petty barbarism, when he removed the wonderful Prague Castle fanfare, which was a modified version of Janacek's Sinfonietta, the Allegro, I think. Yeah. And but I think you're absolutely right to highlight the commonality. Can you just quickly talk about the was there any political competition? I mean, presumably Chaufa couldn't have stayed on. There was no Dubček blew up because he was too unstable. Komárek was too communist. He'd advised Fidel Castro.
And Linarch bombed when he...
Linarch bombed for...
Yeah. Well, there were a few people who, in answer to your second question, there were a few people who may have wanted to be president, but they were, as I'm trying to explain, they were not real contenders. And there was only one serious possibility among them, that was Alexander Dubček, the man of the Prague Spring of 1968, the man who was well respected and well liked by many people because he was really a likable man, and he was also a Slovak, so that also addressed the need for constitutional balance, as long as the Prime Minister, Mr. Adamec, at that time was Czech. So it might seem like a given that the president would be a Slovak. But then Mr. Adamec resigned, and Mr. Chalfa, who was a Slovak, became the Prime Minister, which opened the room for a Czech in the presidency. And it's true that Dubček, who felt wronged and embittered by the 20 years of
working as a woodcutter.
Well, he worked in the office of a woodcutter. I mean, it's
journalistically that was a woodcutter.
Yes, it was a woodcutting business. Yes, and so he felt he had the urge to be rehabilitated and recognized again, and although he did not have much political support in the two groups that coordinated the revolution, the Civic Forum in the Czech lands and the Public Against Violence in Slovakia, he insisted that he should be given a chance. And I think this was not the proudest moment of the Civic Forum, because when they, and the Public Against Violence, because when they realized they had a problem, you know, they shifted it on Havel's shoulders, and they told him, you know, if you are to be a president, you have to talk to that man and talk him out of it. And Havel really tried. They met 5 times in about 10 days in December 1989.
Yeah.
And apparently it was not all that difficult to persuade Dubček to recognize that Havel should be the president, except 2 hours later he changed his mind. And so Havel had to try to do it again, and in the end they worked out an understanding in which Havel would be the president, Dubček would be the Speaker of the Parliament, the second highest job in the country, and 6 months later they would swap.
But although that was promised, they didn't promise to keep the promise.
That's that's the Levy-Eshkol line that I mentioned there. But it was not even so much that Havel did not want to keep the promise, but he simply could not keep the promise, because in 6 months of real time, the subjective time gap was like 20 years or 25 years, and nobody.
I'm going to ask you a very ticklish question, which particularly is still ticklish, which is about the relationship between the Czechs and Slovaks, and whether how it is fair to say that Havel never really got the kind of Slovak sensitivities, if you're being polite, neuroses, if you're being rude, which were ultimately to doom Czechoslovakia as a single state. But while you're thinking about it, of course, it's difficult because you are an ambassador as well as an author. I want to recognise Steve Crawshaw, who pioneered, I think, the coverage of the region in the 80s, and the days when the Independent had, listen to this, 3 correspondents in Moscow, 2 elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, and I think 6 correspondents between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and every one of the countries, plus someone in Vienna and Steve in London. If you look at the Independent now, it's hard to imagine, but then it was the kind of journalistic dynamo of the region, in which I was a very small cog. And I've always been frightfully grateful to Steve for having the the confidence in me to send me. And he and I actually interviewed Havel shortly before the revolution, where I displayed my absolutely fingertip command of the geography of Prague by being unable to find the fish restaurant where Havel was waiting for us. But I do remember that Michael, stepping out of his role as Reuters correspondent, was interpreting for us over that very memorable lunch. So Steve,
Paroplavba or rybárna?
Rybárna.
Rybárna.
I can find it now. But so on that
Thank
note,
you.
Steve, please ask your question.
I've never had such quite a wonderful intro for asking a simple question. Yeah, they were great times, and congratulations to both of you. I mean, first, thank you so much for an incredibly interesting conversation that we've been hearing with Michael. But also, what I wanted to go to was the sense of what people knew and didn't know. I mean, as you guys well know, but everyone in the room should if doesn't, I mean, he had written this amazing essay, The Power of the Powerless, more than 10 years earlier, which talked about what might happen if various things, if the dominoes collapsed, as it were. Edward, to correct you a bit, you may have written it wasn't going to happen, but you also told me at the end of October, when I was late for a demonstration, you said, don't worry, you'll just be in time for the main revolution, which will be just starting. So that conversation was ongoing. And I wanted to address, I was really interested, you said in September that Havel thought he would die under the same system, which is kind of fascinating to me. Every Western leader absolutely had no idea what was coming. But I'm intrigued that this was a time when his best and closest friends in solidarity in neighbouring Poland were already running the country. They'd become prime minister the previous month. In Hungary, his friends were already on the up, and there was talk of a multi-party system, and East Germany was already in turmoil. But leaving aside East Germany, Poland, the change had already come. So did he feel that Czechoslovakianism, how different, that Poles could achieve things but Czechs wouldn't? It really surprises me what you've just said, because I felt that he believed that it would come in due course.
It's a very sensitive thing and very difficult to gauge, because the history at that time was running in terms of hours. So if I ask him a day later, you know, I might have gotten a different answer, and it is certain that in October he was seriously preparing to take the dissident movement public and on a grander scale, and there was a specific discussion of dates and formats and opportunities to do that. A few sentences petition has already garnered 40,000, I think, signatures. So there was a wider pool of support, and the question was when the opportunity would arise. And most people, including the dissidents, thought about the 10th of December as an opportunity to do this. It was International Day of Human Rights, and it was also the first anniversary of a first
legal demonstration
the year before. Nobody thought of 17th of November, you know. That was a day of another anniversary which dates back to the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, and which was then slightly misappropriated by the International Communist Student Movement as an International Students' Day. And so there was a rally on that day, but it was a partly official rally, not a very promising opportunity. Havel went out in the country to spend a few days there. He was not even in Prague when
he'd been very ill, actually, just previously, hadn't he? He'd been in hospital.
He was ill in October, but he was not ill on the week of 17th November. He was actually celebrating a birthday with one of his girlfriends. But
Okay. Now, just to talk a little bit about the Czech-Slovak thing, because that was, you know, he got into a lot of trouble with the Slovaks for surrounding himself with Czechs. There were rather few Slovaks in his inner circle. He didn't make his first trip to Bratislava. He went to Munich and then I think to Germany instead. And he tried hard, but not terribly successfully, to get on with people like Vladimir Mechal, and was actually jostled and sort of almost attacked by Slovaks during one of his visits to Prague. Do you think, in retrospect, there's anything he could have done differently with the Slovaks?
That's one I am not able really to answer to any, even my satisfaction. I simply don't know. I mean, I know for sure that he tried as hard as I've seen anyone trying. He tried to be as sensitive and polite as only he could be to Slovaks. I don't know of many other people who could do more. He tried to bring the Slovaks in the office and succeeded partly. He opened a branch of the president's office in Bratislava and made a point of being there regularly every month for a few days. He initiated an endless series of talks about the constitutional issues and came up with his own proposals on the subject. He was one of the people who was actually, and this is you know, when I tell that to people, they're not aware of that. He was one of the people who was aware, unlike the most of us, including myself, that there might be a problem. Mm-hmm. In the New Year's speech of 1989, the famous speech that is often quoted for different reasons, there is a paragraph in which he says, my top priority, I don't remember, it's to bring this country to democratic elections, and my second priority is to help find an equitable and just and fair relationship between the Czech and Slovak nation. Yeah. Few of us would think of that as a priority in January in 1990. He did. Yet he failed. That's undeniable. We all failed, and the question, you know, whether someone else could have done better is academic. I don't know.
Let's take some more questions. Any Slovaks in the audience who want to come back at me for saying they're neurotic are very welcome to do so. Lady here, yes.
I'm not a Slovak, sorry. My name is Anna Rodnika, I'm Polish, and my question is, there is a tendency right now in Poland, it has been for a few years, to look at the contact of politicians who were part of Solidarity with Bezpieka, with SB. And my question is that right to
look at politicians who were part of Solidarity with...
No, so the contact... I think you mean... That
some of the politicians like Lech Wałęsa have been accused and in part proven to have cooperated with the communists. And my question is it right for us to go back and to believe that we can only achieve closure once all the truth has been brought up to our attention? Or is it lack of sensitivity to context and to some of the things that maybe had to be done in order to bring about change?
That's very. Let's take that question on its own. It's a very substantial one.
Yeah, it's a substantial question, and I will try to avoid commenting on Poland because it hinges on details of what really happened and on the context, as you rightly say, and it's I think for the Polish historians to judge this. As for us, of course, I mean, you can Google out any number of conspiracy theories about the events of the 17th of November, that it was a plot of KGB together with Havel and the dissidents to replace the aging leadership of the Communist Party with another leadership which would be just as subservient to the Russian interests, that it was a personal deal between Havel and the communist leaders, etc., etc. Look, 25 years later, there's not a shred of evidence to show that, and there's massive evidence to the contrary. It is true that there's been a public opinion backlash against the dissidents and the dissident culture and the dissident legacy, because and it's been fed into by many interested people, including a number of politicians whom I'm not going to name, you know, who made up a stereotype of dissidents as a privileged, elitist, you know, group who were supported by money and political support abroad.
Even leaving Mr. Klaus out of it, there are other people who've got criticisms.
I wasn't aware I said any name, but Ed, you know, and while the rest of us were suffering under the communist yoke, and you know, we are the people, the silent majority, who really conducted the revolution. And of course, I mean, if you're a psychologist,
which you are,
which I am, you could easily play with it and look for the you know, guilt syndromes and the alibist syndrome and all kinds of syndromes, but it would get, you know, too involved.
Okay, we won't do that. But I would like to ask you a question about the role of the Soviet Union and then of Russia now, because we have a very, I mean, your question is a very interesting one. We have a very fine focus on
Russia
question.
Now. That's a TV channel, right?
It's all art. No, it's
Russia
RT.
Today. Russia Today. Yes.
We have a very fine focus on the interaction between the local regimes and the local dissidents, and so we see everything in Poland in terms of the Polish authorities and the Polish opposition, in Czechoslovakia, the STB, and so on. But there's a kind of third factor. There's an elephant in the room, which is that the Soviet Union didn't trust the local regimes to keep a proper lid on things, so they had their own channels of information and their own contacts, their own intelligence networks. And then after the war came down, people thought that Russia had retreated forever, that Russia was out of Central Europe, and that was it. And we actually see not at all that Russia is back in terms of finance, in terms of energy, in terms of even the extraordinary situation of a Russian dissident being extradited from Prague airport under the nose of the Czech government, with the opposition of the Czech government, and it still happened with FSB officials doing that at gunpoint. So it's clear that Russia is, this is the Torobanov case, so it's clear that Russia is back in a big way, and that was something that Havel was very worried about towards the end of his life. But can you just talk us through this sort of missing Soviet/Russian element in the history?
Yeah, well, it did seem in 1989 like Russia was going away, but you know, there was never a chance of it. We were just too preoccupied with what was happening and with what we were doing. But it's, you know, the largest country in the world with some of the largest natural resources in the world. It's not too far from, you know, where we live, and it's been since the Napoleonic War. It's been a part of European history in general and Central European history in particular. So that was a false expectation, if anyone had it, and Havel was concerned already in 1990, as he took over the presidency, and in the speech to the joint sessions of the American Congress, You know, he says...
Which you interpreted. Oh, you...
Yeah, which he says badly, says Klaus said yesterday. But going back to that, that's important thing. He said to the Congress, if you want to help us, help the Soviet Union on its way to democracy. Because he always felt that it was essential that the Russians and the other nations of the former Soviet Union travel along the same path to freedom and democracy as the rest of us, maybe on a slower trajectory. It's a huge country and with somewhat non-democratic traditions, admittedly, but he thought they could get there. He thought that Gorbachev made a contribution to getting there. He thought that Yeltsin, for all his flaws, was on the right track. And then...
And he didn't like Putin.
And then he became very concerned about Putin because he thought, rightly so in my thinking, that he recognized something in him that he knew, that he had known, you know, in the past.
This is your chance to plug my books. Can we have some more questions, please? Yes, lady here.
Thank you. I would be interested to have a little more information about the young Václav Havel. For example, at what stage did he develop his interest in freedom of speech, human rights and so forth? Was it during university days, or did he come from a family background where these topics would be discussed over the dinner table?
Right, let's have, and the gentleman there, please. Oh, I recognise, but please introduce yourself for those who don't know.
Ivan Sloboda, the Slovak in the audience. I would like to just deal or ask you about the later stages of breaking up of Czechoslovakia. And that is not so much for Havel's role or responsibility. I think it's probably not, wouldn't be a fair description, but his attitude to it. But also any inside or behind the scenes knowledge of the breakup, which is not so publicly known.
I think I'm going to recommend that you read the book, which has some very good bits of that, but we'll answer it briefly. Let's take another couple of questions. Anyone else wants to ask something?
I can't hold more than 3, so...
Okay, well then...
no, there's one more. Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question about, which you state at the very beginning that Havel was a very friendly person, but also quite reserved. And it was very hard to say who his really close friends were. What I was really struck by was his friendship with the Dalai Lama, and I wonder if that was, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. So we have some very wide range of questions. The young Václav Havel and what his childhood influences and his on him politically. Anything on Slovakia
and Dalai Lama.
The important question of Tibet.
Well, Havel grew up in a very enlightened family with a very liberal tradition. His parents held a kind of a salon. There were many Czech writers and politicians and intellectuals attending that, and he grew up with a keen interest in politics. He was 5 or 6, and his mother wrote to her mother, his grandmother, who was coming to visit. She warned her that little Václav will probably want to read her the editorials, and he also, but maybe also because of the family history and the background, he also grew up with a keen sense of injustice and the need to confront instances of injustice. And you can see in his very early speeches, he was, I think, 20 years old when he made his first speech to the Union of Writers in 1955 or 56. And he, in the speech, he does not speak about his own situation, about his own sense of injustice, but he invokes the cases of other writers who were persecuted or silenced or ignored, and he calls on the Union of Writers to set that injustice right. And he's been very consistent in this throughout his life, before he was president, when he was president, and after he left as president. This he's always raised his voice in these instances. Now, for the Slovak question, Havel did not play a direct role in the very final stages of the dissolution of Czechoslovakia. He was outmaneuvered and basically kept on the sidelines when the two victors of the parliamentary elections in 1992 on the Slovak side and on the Czech side met in Brno and in Bratislava and basically made a cabinet agreement to divide the country. It still rankles. I mean, we can say in retrospect that the disaster some of us were fearing at the time did not materialize, that both countries did reasonably well, and at some point Slovakia, the country for which we had greater concerns at the time, did at some points better than the Czech part of the country did. So you could say all is well that ends well, and this was as reasonably good ending as there are in separations of countries. But it came back to me when I was witnessing the campaign before the referendum about the Scottish independence and its results, because I couldn't help thinking, maybe we should have had a vote. I mean, I know we should have had a vote, but we didn't find a way to have a vote at the time, and I couldn't help thinking, it's such a nice thing to have a vote and to have a verdict, and now, people can go back to other things, and at least for a time the question is settled.
So we hope.
And we will never know, because all the opinion polls at the time, showed that there was a majority in both parts of the country in favor of keeping it together.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And talk about the spiritual Havel, perhaps both with his relationship with the Dalai Lama and perhaps also his relationship with the more with European Christianity.
Yes, it was a spirituality that's not there early on, that you can date it more or less to his first time in prison, in the first signs of that in 1977, from where it developed considerably into a spiritual outlook, which was not a direct directly religious outlook. I mean, Havel never identified with any particular religion, in spite of attempts of people to place him within the context of Catholicism or Buddhism or any other religion. But he craved the spiritual experience, and he developed the idea of the ultimate horizon at which one should aspire, and at which all our deeds will be judged one day, and which is the core of our responsibility. And in the New Year's speech in 1990, he says, and you know, there are two invitations we should make, one to the Pope. He was the Polish Pope then, John Paul II, and Jan Pavel II, and one to the Dalai Lama, and they both came, and it was a very moving. Both these encounters were extremely moving, because they spent, with Dalai Lama, they spent a lot of time laughing, and without anyone being able to tell what they are laughing at, and
they both speak, both the Dalai Lama and Václav Havel spoke rather idiosyncratic English, but they seem to be able to communicate beautifully.
They did. They seemed to be able to communicate. There was a problem. Havel wanted to meditate with the Dalai Lama, but you can't ask a Buddhist spiritual leader to meditate. You have to be invited. You know, he's the guru. I mean, he has to invite you. So we had to intrigue a little to obtain the invitation. Then they meditated in, of all places, a Catholic chapel at the Havel's country retreat in Lani, and 20 years later, here in London, when I interviewed the Dalai Lama for the book, I